Today's story covers 3 harrowing cases of abduction and survival that stunned the world. 3 women endure over a decade of unimaginable captivity in an ordinary Cleveland home. A young girl is stolen from her family and held for 18 years in plain sight, and another teenager's disappearance turns into a story of hope after months of despair. These are stories of terror, resilience, and the fight for freedom against all odds. But before we begin, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you're in the right place. We upload daily, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an upload. Alright, let's get into today's story. On a quiet afternoon in Cleveland, 2002, Michelle Knight walked alone through her neighborhood, lost in her thoughts. Life had been challenging for Michelle, and she was out that day searching for help with custody matters involving her young son. When a familiar face appeared, she felt a moment of relief. Ariel Castro, a local school bus driver, recognized her. He offered her a ride, assuring her it would be no trouble. Michelle, seeing no reason to distrust him, accepted his offer. But as they drove, something felt off. She noticed they weren't heading toward any place she recognized. Her pulse quickened as Ariel pulled up to his home, explaining he needed to pick something up inside. Against her instincts, she followed him in, still holding on to the belief that this was just a quick detour. Once inside, the air grew tense. Ariel led her through a dimly lit hallway, and suddenly, the door closed behind her. The reality of her situation began to settle in. With no way out, Michelle realized she was trapped. The walls seemed to close in as Ariel's demeanor shifted. Her pleas went unanswered, and her hopes of leaving that house shattered. Days turned into weeks, and Michelle remained in captivity. In those early weeks, Ariel kept her confined to a small dark room. The windows were boarded up, casting the room in a perpetual shadow. Alone and isolated, Michelle struggled to make sense of what was happening as her surroundings became her prison. The few times she heard footsteps approach, her heart would race, knowing it could mean another encounter with her captor. He held control over every part of her life, turning ordinary days into an unending nightmare. Almost a year later, on a warm summer day in 2003, another young girl from Cleveland would find herself facing the same fate. Amanda Berry was just 16, excited about the independence that came with her new job at a local Burger King. As she finished her shift, Amanda eagerly planned her evening, thinking about her family's plans for her birthday the next day. She made her way home on foot, feeling that familiar sense of freedom. But that night, Ariel Castro drove past her, recognizing her from the neighborhood. He pulled over, offering her a ride home. Like Michelle, Amanda saw no reason to be suspicious. She climbed into his car, reassured by the familiar face behind the wheel. But her sense of safety quickly unraveled. Unraveled. Ariel began driving in a direction Amanda didn't recognize. She grew tense, her eyes darting around, looking for a way out. When they reached his house, he convinced her to come inside under the guise of showing her a puppy for his daughter. Amanda hesitated, but her guard was down, and she reluctantly followed him inside. Like Michelle, she found herself cornered, with no chance of escape. Ariel's demeanor turned dark, and Amanda realized she'd walked into a trap. Amanda's world shrank as Ariel's house became her prison. She was forced into a room down the hall from where Michelle was held, though she had no idea that someone else was enduring the same nightmare. Ariel made sure the girls remained isolated, ensuring that even in their shared suffering, they would feel completely alone. Days dragged on as Amanda adapted to a life of confinement. In those long hours, she held onto the hope of seeing her family again, counting each day, her spirit refusing to break. Ariel's methods were chillingly calculated. He moved through the house with a practiced routine, attending to his life outside, all while hiding the lives had taken captive within his walls. He controlled every detail, monitoring his victims with a suffocating grip that left no room for error. Any sign of resistance was met with harsh consequences, and Amanda quickly learned that her survival depended on maintaining his twisted sense of control. She listened to his footsteps, memorizing his movements, always bracing herself for his return. 2 years later, in 2004, Ariel struck again. 14-year-old Gina DeJesus was walking home from school, chatting excitedly with Ariel's daughter, who happened to be her friend. When Ariel appeared and offered Gina a ride, she hesitated, then agreed, thinking only of a brief lift to her house. But once she was in the car, she knew something was wrong. Ariel drove her to his home instead, trapping her in the same way he'd ensnared the others. Gina's youth and innocence made the betrayal feel even more cruel. She had trusted him as her friend's father, never suspecting the nightmare she was about to endure. Gina was taken to another room in the house, isolated like Michelle and Amanda. In the suffocating quiet, she realized that her world had just changed forever. She spent endless days waiting, hoping that someone would come looking for her, that somehow she would escape. But Ariel had perfected his techniques, making sure there were no signs of life inside his house. To the outside world, he was just another man living his life on a quiet street in Cleveland, while inside, he held 3 women captive, their lives hidden away behind locked doors. Over the years, Ariel worked to instill fear in his victims, using their isolation as his weapon. The girls learned to stay silent, to anticipate his mood swings, and to endure his presence. They became prisoners in a space where light rarely entered, their days blending into a haze of fear and survival. The walls that confined them became as familiar as their own thoughts, each girl holding on to memories of their families, their hopes, and the life that once existed outside. In the dark corners of the house, their lives were hidden, each girl grappling with her own way of coping. Michelle, Amanda, and Gina clung to fragments of hope, imagining the day they might be free. And as the years passed, the neighborhood around them carried on, unaware of the horrors taking place within those walls, unaware that Ariel Castro was hiding a sinister secret in plain sight. Within Ariel Castro's house, days passed in a bleak, unchanging rhythm, and Michelle, Amanda, and Gina settled into a routine forced upon them. The rooms were dark and airless, with windows blocked and doors locked tight. Michelle, confined longer than the others, had become accustomed to the isolation, but nothing could lessen the sense of being hidden from the world. They existed in silence, speaking only when necessary, each girl adapting to the small spaces that had become their worlds. For Michelle, the early days had been the most disorienting, filled with a dizzying confusion. Ariel would appear at irregular intervals, his footsteps heralding his approach, each time evoking a wave of dread. The uncertainty gnawed at her, as did the hunger and cold of those long nights. Ariel controlled every detail. He decided when they ate, when they could see light, and when they were left in darkness. The silence was broken only by the sounds of his movements, the metallic clang of keys, and the soft creak of floorboards, reminders of how close he always was. Amanda, abducted in the year following Michelle, brought her own strength into this grim environment. She focused on the hope that her family would not stop searching, that her absence would be felt. To stave off the suffocating isolation, Amanda created routines within her mind, counting the days and setting small goals, like memorizing patterns in the room. When she was alone, she would think of her family, replaying moments with them in her head to keep her spirits up. This mental escape became her shield against despair. Ariel kept the girls separate, ensuring they would not see each other or speak. But even without physical interaction, a silent understanding began to form. Each girl felt the presence of the others, aware that they were not alone in this nightmare, though they rarely caught more than a glimpse of one another. In passing, they would occasionally hear a faint voice, or glimpse a shadow, fleeting reminders of their shared confinement. In 2004, Gina joined the others, and the house grew even more tense. At just 14, Gina had a resilience that masked her youth. Like Amanda and Michelle before her, she spent her days piecing together a routine that could give her a sense of normalcy, even in such dark circumstances. When she could, she would listen intently to sounds from outside, distant cars, the hum of a lawnmower. These faint reminders of life beyond the house gave her brief, fragile moments of hope. Inside, Ariel's control was all-encompassing. He restricted everything: contact, movement, and even speech. The girls quickly learned to move quietly, anticipating his needs and moods to avoid punishment. Silence was their survival tactic. Over time, he allowed Amanda to watch small bits of TV and radio, but even these were monitored, another way to control the narrative and enforce his twisted version of reality. Through these fragmented glimpses, Amanda would hear news reports about her own disappearance, her family's pleas, and even searches that went so close, yet never found her. Each mention of her name was a reminder of the world beyond the walls, a world that seemed impossibly far away. As the years passed, small gestures of defiance began to emerge in each of the girls, though they were careful to mask them. Michelle, known for her strength and endurance, held tightly to memories and dreams, her only rebellion in a life so tightly controlled. Amanda found strength in her thoughts of home, often imagining conversations with her family that brought her comfort. Gina, youngest of all, clung to her memories of friends, of school, and her family, keeping her spirit alive in quiet, unspoken ways. The house itself became a symbol of Ariel's control. He meticulously hid signs of his captives, storing them in rooms with heavy locks, away from any prying eyes. His own life continued outside the home, a stark contrast to the hidden existence within. He maintained his work as a school bus driver, even socialized on occasion, all while hiding this dark secret in plain sight. Neighbors noted little about him beyond his quiet demeanor and occasional sightings around the neighborhood. No one suspected the depth of his deception. Seasons changed, but inside, time lost its meaning. The girls found ways to mark its passage, noting small changes. The way light shifted when Ariel opened a door, the pattern of noises from outside that hinted at the world moving forward. They became attuned to the sounds of the house, each creak and rustle a language of its own, allowing them to sense his movements, to prepare themselves when he approached. One day, Ariel arrived with a new cruelty. He reinforced the boarded windows, adding layers to block any hint of sunlight. For Michelle, Amanda, and Gina, this change deepened their sense of isolation. Days blended into nights, the darkness pressing in. They existed in a surreal limbo, and any remaining awareness of time slipped further away. Ariel's visits grew more sporadic, his demeanor more volatile, and the girls learned to brace for the unpredictability of his presence. Yet, even in this suffocating darkness, hope endured. They began to catch the occasional glimpse of one another in the dim light, seeing signs of shared struggle etched into each other's faces. In these rare, brief moments, they exchanged unspoken messages, simple glances that affirmed they were not alone in this ordeal. This silent solidarity gave them strength, a fragile lifeline in an otherwise desolate existence. Amanda, who held tightly to thoughts of her family, drew comfort from knowing that somewhere, her mother and sister were still searching. Gina, too, held on to memories of home, of the life that had been so abruptly taken from her. They imagined walking out of that house, reuniting with loved ones, and returning to the lives they had once known. The longer they stayed, the more determined they became to survive, each holding on to the hope that one day, their suffering would end. For now, Ariel controlled every element of their lives, from the smallest sound to the rare beams of light that seeped through cracks in the boarded windows. But in their minds, Michelle, Amanda, and Gina held on to a world far beyond the walls, clinging to the possibility of freedom. And although their hopes seemed faint, each day they survived became a silent testament to their resilience. As the years wore on, Ariel Castro's control over his captives grew both rigid and erratic. His mood swings became more intense, and the conditions inside the house deteriorated. Despite these challenges, Amanda, Michelle, and Gina found strength in small acts of defiance and moments of inner resolve. Every day they survived was a testament to their resilience and a quiet rebellion against the control Castro held over them. One pivotal moment for Amanda came in 2006 when she realized she was going to have a child. This new reality sparked a complex mix of emotions, fear, hope, and a fierce determination to protect the life she now carried. Her body became a battleground, enduring the harsh conditions of captivity, and as she grew weaker, her focus shifted to her unborn child. The room she occupied felt both comforting and imprisoning, with nothing but shadows and silence around her. She began speaking softly to the life inside her, envisioning a future beyond those walls. When Amanda's child was born, the baby became a bright spot in the house, a symbol of hope that breathed new life into a world that had felt stagnant. The presence of a child changed the energy within the house, sparking a shared sense of purpose among the women. Amanda devoted herself to protecting her daughter, shielding her as much as possible from the dark reality they were trapped in. The other women, too, found solace in the child's presence, caring for her as best they could, and finding brief moments of joy in her laughter and innocence. This small, shared joy became an anchor for their spirits, a reminder of the world outside and the potential for life beyond Castro's control. Over the years, Amanda, Michelle, and Gina carefully monitored Ariel's routines, noting when he left the house and how long he stayed away. These observations, made in silence and stored in memory, became crucial as they began to consider the possibility of escape. Every time Ariel left, the hope for freedom burned a little brighter. But each attempt to act on this hope was met with near misses and moments of crushing disappointment. One day, Gina managed to loosen a board covering her window, allowing a sliver of light to enter her room for the first time in years. The sunlight illuminated the dust in the air, casting an ethereal glow that brought tears to her eyes. She tried to widen the gap to see if there might be a way to escape, but the risk was too great. She feared discovery and the potential repercussions, and in a bitter moment she was forced to abandon her attempt, her mind racing with the consequences. Yet, the experience fueled her determination, proving that escape might one day be possible. Michelle, ever observant, noted that certain times of day offered them brief windows of solitude. She devised subtle strategies to gather more information about the house's layout, understanding the locks, the doors, and the weak spots. Ariel had become so secure in his power over them that he occasionally left small clues in his wake, a misplaced key, a slightly ajar door, details that Michelle memorized and stored away. Her mind became a map of possibilities, a survival tool that grew sharper with every passing year. In 2013, the whispers of freedom grew louder, and Amanda began formulating a plan. Castro had begun to trust her with minor responsibilities, small tasks that allowed her brief access to parts of the house she hadn't seen in years. She used these moments to her advantage, noting every possible escape route. Her focus shifted entirely toward getting her daughter out safely, and she began rehearsing how she would handle the situation when the opportunity finally arose. One morning, Amanda noticed that Castro had left the front door slightly unlocked. Her heart pounded as she tested the handle, nerves running high as she considered what this could mean. She knew it was a risk, that he could return at any moment, but the desire to escape overwhelmed the fear. She made a snap decision, clutching her daughter's hand and moving toward the door. As she reached it, she found herself staring down at the street, sunlight and fresh air pouring in. The sounds of a normal world so close she could almost touch them. Amanda's voice caught as she called out, her plea echoing down the street. A neighbor passing by heard her cries and stopped, disbelief and confusion flickering across his face as he realized what was happening. He ran toward her, helping her and her daughter outside, his voice shaking as he promised that help was on the way. The realization hit her that she was finally free, that her years of silent endurance had paid off, and she clung to her daughter, feeling a surge of relief and hope. News of Amanda's escape spread quickly, and within moments, police officers arrived on the scene. The sounds of sirens filled the air as neighbors gathered, shocked to learn of the horrors hidden within the quiet house. The police entered the home and found Michelle and Gina, rescuing them from the darkness that had held them captive for so many years. For the first time, the women were able to step into the light, away from the shadows of Castro's control. The morning air was thick with anticipation as neighbors gathered outside Ariel Castro's house, each face marked by a blend of shock and disbelief. News of Amanda's escape, along with the revelations of Michelle and Gina's rescue, spread rapidly through the streets of Cleveland, bringing a swift wave of law enforcement, media, and curious onlookers to the scene. For the first time in over a decade, the quiet facade of Ariel's home revealed its terrible secrets, and the city began to grapple with the enormity of what had taken place within its walls. Inside the house, detectives moved methodically through each room, their faces grim as they uncovered the makeshift prison where Amanda, Michelle, and Gina had been held. The rooms bore signs of their confinement, crude locks, heavily boarded windows, and layers of reinforcement designed to silence the outside world. The scene painted a stark picture of the girls' lives in captivity, a space crafted to strip them of their freedom and independence. Each detail added to the weight of the tragedy, and the officers moved with a solemn determination, gathering evidence and bearing witness to the horror that had been hidden in plain sight. For the women, freedom brought an overwhelming mix of relief and uncertainty. Amanda, clutching her young daughter, felt a wave of emotions as she stood among people, exposed to sunlight, and took her first steps toward reclaiming her life. Every sound and sight seemed amplified, an unfamiliar intensity after years of isolation. The crowd offered words of encouragement, strangers reaching out to offer comfort. Amanda felt their warmth, a stark contrast to the years of solitude, and she began to realize that life, once a distant dream, was now within reach. Michelle, too, emerged with a quiet resilience, her eyes adjusting to the brightness of the world beyond Castro's walls. She had endured more than a decade in captivity, her strength tested time and again, and now, standing among the officers and well-wishers, she felt a surge of freedom she hadn't dared to imagine. Her mind raced as she took in the bustling scene, the unfamiliar faces, and the growing realization that she was no longer alone. Her journey back to herself had begun, and each breath of fresh air felt like a step toward reclaiming what had been stolen. Gina, the youngest of the three, looked around with wide eyes, feeling both liberated and overwhelmed. She had entered that house as a young teenager, and now stood outside as a young adult, her world forever changed. Seeing her family again filled her with an indescribable joy, the embrace of loved ones grounding her as she began the long road to healing. The years of captivity had left their mark, but her spirit remained unbroken. Surrounded by family, Gina felt an unexpected surge of hope, the weight of her ordeal softened by the presence of those who had waited for her return. In the days that followed, Cleveland came together to support the survivors, their stories drawing compassion from across the community and beyond. Vigils were held, and the city honored the resilience of these women who had endured unimaginable hardship. News outlets captured every moment, from their initial medical examinations to the heartfelt reunions with their families, each headline a testament to their bravery. The world watched as Amanda, Michelle, and Gina navigated their first steps toward freedom, grappling with a reality they had dreamed of for so long, but that now felt daunting in its complexity. Law enforcement worked swiftly to secure evidence against Castro, piecing together the years of abuse and captivity through statements from the women and the physical evidence found within his home. Investigators were struck by the meticulous methods he used to ensure their confinement, as well as the calculated risks he had taken to maintain his life outside without drawing suspicion. Despite the dark revelations, there was a sense of closure in bringing the full extent of his crimes to light, a process that underscored the resilience of the women who had survived under his control. As the case against Castro grew, the community expressed outrage at his actions and sought justice on behalf of the survivors. Castro's arrest marked a turning point, a moment that symbolized accountability and the strength of those he had wronged. Each step of the legal proceedings served as a reminder of the resilience of Amanda, Michelle, and Gina, and their courage inspired countless others who had faced their own struggles. Their stories became symbols of survival and hope, lighting a path forward for others who had endured hardship. For the survivors, the process of healing was only beginning. Reintegrating into society posed challenges, each of them working to rebuild lives that had been on hold for so many years. The familiarity of family and friends provided a foundation, but the road to recovery would be long and marked by its own set of trials. Still, each day offered new possibilities, opportunities to rediscover themselves and embrace the world that had waited so patiently for their return. The city of Cleveland rallied around them, providing support and resources to aid their transition. Community groups and counseling services reached out, offering a safe space for them to process their trauma and find strength in one another. Amanda, Michelle, and Gina leaned on this network of support, their bond growing deeper as they shared their experiences and navigated the journey of healing together. The three women, united by their shared ordeal, found solace in their resilience and in the friendships they had forged within the walls of Castro's house. Together, they vowed to look forward, to seek happiness, and reclaim the lives that had been stolen. Their courage, a quiet but powerful force, became a source of hope and inspiration, not only to those who knew them, but to the countless individuals who had followed their story. In the weeks following their rescue, Amanda, Michelle, and Gina worked to rebuild their lives, each step a testament to their strength. Though the journey ahead was filled with challenges, they faced it with resilience. With the support of their families, therapists, and each other, the women began to find moments of peace in their newfound freedom. Daily routines, once tightly controlled, were now shaped by their own choices, a precious aspect of life they'd longed for in captivity. As Ariel Castro awaited his fate, prosecutors built a strong case against him. His actions, once hidden, were now exposed in court, and the weight of the evidence left no doubt as to the horrors he had inflicted. The trial gave the survivors a voice, a chance to stand as witnesses to their own strength. Public outrage over Castro's crimes was fierce, and Cleveland's support for the women was unwavering. Their courage in confronting their trauma inspired many, transforming them from victims into symbols of hope and survival. On August 1, 2013, the day of Castro's sentencing arrived. The courtroom was filled with the quiet tension of those eager for justice. Castro received a sentence of life plus 1,000 years, without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again harm another person. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted as the judge delivered the final verdict, a powerful statement that marked the end of his control over the lives he had tried to destroy. This moment, a culmination of years of resilience, brought a measure of closure to the city and to the survivors. As the news of his sentencing spread, the world celebrated the resilience of Amanda, Michelle, and Gina. Their strength in enduring the darkest of circumstances became a powerful reminder of the human spirit's capacity for resilience. The community rallied to support them, raising funds and creating foundations in their names to help others who had faced similar experiences. Their stories, though born of pain, became sources of hope, showing others that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, survival and recovery were possible. The women's journey toward healing continued, each of them finding ways to embrace life beyond Castro's shadow. Michelle channeled her experiences into art, using creativity to process her trauma and connect with others. Amanda, inspired by the support she had received, chose to focus on her family and help others through public advocacy. Gina, surrounded by loved ones, committed herself to creating a future filled with purpose and compassion. Their paths, though different, were united by a shared determination to reclaim their lives. Over time, Amanda, Michelle, and Gina found ways to give back, sharing their stories and connecting with others who needed hope. They appeared in public, spoke at events, and lent their voices to causes dedicated to preventing and addressing situations like theirs. In doing so, they transformed their suffering into strength, creating a legacy of resilience that reached far beyond Cleveland. The impact of their story rippled through the city, touching countless lives and reshaping how the community understood survival. People who had followed their journey found inspiration in their determination, and the survivors became beacons of hope for those facing their own challenges. The strength Amanda, Michelle, and Gina displayed showed others that they too could endure and find light on the other side of hardship. Through their courage, the survivors rewrote their story, proving that while Castro may have tried to confine them, he could not diminish their strength or break their spirits. Their bond, forged in resilience, became a reminder that even the darkest of circumstances could not erase the power of hope. The next story is called Stolen Childhood. On a morning in June 1991, 11-year-old Jaycee Dugard was walking along her usual path to the bus stop, just steps away from her South Lake Tahoe home. Nestled among the serene pine trees and the cool mountain air, her small town in California felt like a safe haven for parents and kids alike. But for Jaycee, that ordinary day was about to take a terrifying turn, one that would forever change her life. Jaycee was a friendly, cheerful girl with a love for animals and a close bond with her family, especially her mother, Terry Probin. That day, as Jaycee headed to school, she likely had her usual thoughts, her mind drifting to her friends, her classroom, and all the ordinary things an 11-year-old might think about. But as she rounded the corner of her familiar path, a car, a gray sedan, unexpectedly pulled up beside her. Before she could process what was happening, a man with a hardened look in his eyes, Philip Garrido, leaned out and quickly approached. Philip Garrido wasn't a stranger to criminal acts, though Jaycee had no way of knowing this. His presence was menacing, his intentions clear only to him. In an instant, he grabbed Jaycee and forced her into the car, a place where Nancy Garrido, his wife, waited. Nancy watched in silence, complicit in what was happening, her own motivations shrouded in mystery. Helpless, Jaycee could do nothing as the door slammed shut, trapping her in a nightmare. Jaycee's mother, Terry, was just starting her day when she received news that would turn her world upside down. Jaycee hadn't arrived at school. As panic set in, Terry contacted friends, family, and eventually, law enforcement. Jaycee's disappearance was immediate and terrifying. The community rallied, neighbors searched, and police poured resources into finding her, combing the area, hoping for any trace that might lead to her return. Flyers with Jaycee's photograph, her smiling face with blonde hair and bright eyes, were posted on every corner. Yet, despite the widespread search, it seemed as if she had vanished without a trace. Inside the car, Jaycee was taken far from her home to a secluded property owned by Garrido, a place hidden from the world where she would remain out of sight for nearly 2 decades. The journey marked her final moments of freedom. As the car sped toward her captor's property, fear and confusion consumed her. She didn't know where she was going or if anyone would ever find her. The Garrido home was an unassuming place in Antioch, California, but behind its modest facade lay a hidden, fenced-off backyard. It was there, in a makeshift shed, that Jaycee would be imprisoned. Philip Garrido, known to have disturbing beliefs and a dark past, was determined to keep her isolated from the world. The shed had no windows and only one door, which could only be opened from the outside. The walls were lined with soundproofing to prevent anyone from hearing Jaycee's cries for help. In her first days in captivity, Jaycee endured unimaginable fear and loneliness. She longed for her mother, her family, and the safety of her home. She could hear Philip Garrido's voice, sometimes calm, sometimes unhinged, as he spoke to her, attempting to justify his actions with twisted explanations. Nancy Garrido was a constant presence as well, but there was no comfort in her company. She had taken on the role of a twisted enabler, indifferent to Jaycee's terror and isolation. For Jaycee, each passing day became a test of endurance and strength. To ensure she remained completely dependent on them, the Garridos stripped her of her identity, even renaming her Alyssa. Jaycee was forced to adopt this new name, as if her past life no longer existed. She had no access to the outside world, no friends, no family, no schooling, and no hint of the familiar. The little girl who loved animals and dreamed of growing up was slowly being replaced by a captive, her sense of self being torn away. The months stretched into years, and yet Jaycee's will to survive did not falter. She found small ways to cope, small routines that gave her a sense of control over the otherwise oppressive environment. Garrido's moods swung wildly, and his behavior was often erratic and unpredictable. Yet Jaycee adapted, learning how to read his moods, how to navigate the shifting dynamics in her confined world. In this prison, Jaycee also had to come to terms with a reality few could fathom. She would grow up in captivity, her childhood stolen. And despite the terror, she resolved to survive, drawing on an inner resilience that her captors couldn't fully comprehend. Over time, this quiet strength would become her anchor, a lifeline she clung to, as day after day, year after year, she held on to the hope that one day she might see her family again. And as her confinement continued, Jaycee would find herself in increasingly complex situations, facing challenges that would further test her resilience. Her story was far from over, and the impact of her kidnapping would ripple far beyond the walls of her captivity, touching the lives of many, even as the world continued to search for answers. In the quiet, hidden spaces of Philip Garrido's backyard, Jaycee Dugard entered an unimaginable world that would soon become her reality. The days began to blur together, and Jaycee's life became one of isolation, fear, and uncertainty. Each morning, she would awaken in the dim light of her shed, surrounded by 4 walls that held her captive from everything she had once known. With no windows, and only faint traces of natural light seeping through, the small enclosed space reminded her that escape was impossible. Philip Garrido, a complex and erratic man, controlled every part of Jaycee's existence. His intentions were sinister, and he sought to control not only her actions, but her very sense of self. His unpredictable nature meant that Jaycee had to be constantly alert, reading his every word and action, trying to predict the shifts in his mood. She learned to adjust to his commands, recognizing that any deviation could bring harsh consequences. And when he spoke, his words often carried a disturbing tone, an attempt to justify the life he forced upon her with twisted philosophies. Nancy Garrido, Philip's wife and accomplice, was never far away either. She appeared at times indifferent, at other times seeking to form a connection with Jaycee, as if she wanted Jaycee to view her as a sort of caretaker. But this Care was always bound by limits, and every effort she made was laced with manipulation, keeping Jaycee dependent. For Jaycee, the presence of Nancy complicated things, adding another layer to her captivity. Any thought of escaping was overshadowed by the realization that she was outnumbered, held captive not by one person, but by a pair united in their control over her. As the months turned into years, Jaycee's world continued to shrink. Philip and Nancy would bring her limited supplies, just enough to sustain her, with little thought given to her comfort. Her clothing, food, and any small belongings were monitored. They controlled when and how she could access these things, using them as tools to reinforce their dominance. But, with time, Jaycee managed to create tiny routines, ways to establish a sense of normalcy amidst the chaos. She created small goals for herself, ways to organize her space, thoughts to cling to, that helped her survive emotionally. In her mind, she held on to the memories of her mother and her previous life, knowing that letting go of them would mean truly surrendering to this nightmare. At some point, Jaycee was given minimal supplies to occupy her time. She would draw, write, or create small crafts, actions that helped her maintain a sense of identity and purpose. In her writings, she reflected on memories, her dreams, and her hopes for freedom, using these small expressions as a way to remind herself of who she was beyond her life in captivity. Even in her darkest moments, Jaycee clung to a belief that she would one day be free. These tiny acts of resilience were her defiance against the isolation imposed on her. One day, years after her abduction, Jaycee faced an unexpected and life-changing development. She discovered she was pregnant. For a young girl held in captivity, the thought of becoming a mother was both overwhelming and terrifying. With limited knowledge and resources, Jaycee prepared herself for this unknown journey, all the while knowing that her captors were indifferent to the struggles she would face. Philip's view of himself as a savior of sorts took on disturbing dimensions, as he saw the pregnancy as a twisted validation of his control over Jaycee. Nancy, meanwhile, viewed the impending birth with detachment, though she took on the role of assistant in this experience, guiding Jaycee through the bare minimum needed for a healthy delivery. In the harsh confinement of her small living quarters, Jaycee gave birth to her first child. She faced this life-changing event alone in spirit, surrounded only by those who kept her confined, with no loving family or community by her side. The experience was profound and frightening, yet Jaycee embraced the role of mother with the same resilience that had kept her going all along. Her focus shifted from her own survival to the well-being of her child, who, despite the circumstances, became a new source of light and hope in her life. This child became a companion, someone to love, and a reason to persevere. Over the next few years, Jaycee had a second child under the same conditions. Her captivity had expanded beyond herself, now including her two daughters. Despite their unusual and confined existence, Jaycee did everything she could to nurture them, striving to create a safe space within the limits of her captivity. She invented games, created learning exercises, and introduced them to stories she could recall from her own childhood, hoping to give them a sense of wonder and curiosity, even in such restricted conditions. She instilled in her daughters the belief that the world was larger than the four walls they knew, and that life held possibilities far beyond the reach of the backyard. The challenges of motherhood under captivity were immense. With few resources and no support system, Jaycee had to rely on her own instincts and creativity. She taught her daughters basic skills and used what limited materials she had to create a learning environment. To the best of her ability, she shielded them from the disturbing nature of their reality, creating a cocoon of care and love in a place that otherwise lacked warmth or kindness. For Jaycee, raising her daughters became an extension of her will to survive, a determination to protect them, and ensure that they would one day know a world beyond captivity. Philip Garrido, meanwhile, continued to operate in his chaotic, unpredictable way. Despite his criminal tendencies, he sought to project a facade of normalcy, even bringing Jaycee and her daughters out in public on rare occasions. These excursions, however, were always carefully monitored. Jaycee was forced to comply, her identity masked to prevent anyone from recognizing her. The brief moments of exposure to the outside world filled Jaycee with conflicting emotions. Joy at seeing life beyond her prison, but despair at the knowledge that she couldn't escape without risking her daughter's safety. Through the years, there were missed opportunities for intervention. Neighbors, Local authorities and even police officers came into contact with Garrido and occasionally caught glimpses of Jaycee and her daughters, but Philip's web of control and manipulation shielded the truth. He was skilled at presenting himself as an eccentric but harmless individual, using his persona to deflect suspicion and keep his crimes hidden. Jaycee learned to mask her emotions during these rare encounters, suppressing any hope that might give her away, knowing that attempting to escape or call for help could bring severe repercussions. Despite the crushing conditions, Jaycee never lost hope. Her daughters had become her reason to keep going, and she focused on protecting and nurturing them, even as her own dreams of freedom grew faint. The years continued to pass, but within the quiet strength she had cultivated, Jaycee found a determination that sustained her through each day, even as freedom seemed as distant as ever. As Jaycee's daughters grew, so did her sense of responsibility to shield them from the reality of their lives. While they only knew the confined world within Garrido's backyard, Jaycee was determined to give them a sense of normalcy. She taught them as much as she could, using scraps of paper and limited resources to create lessons. Even in captivity, she instilled in them a love of learning, storytelling, and wonder about the outside world. She would recount memories of her own childhood, painting a picture of life beyond the tall fences and dense hedges that enclosed their reality. Her daughter's laughter and curiosity became a source of strength for her, reminding her of the life and love she still held despite her captor's control. As her daughters reached school age, Jaycee's desperation to educate and prepare them for a different life grew stronger. She taught them how to read and write, introducing them to stories and songs she remembered from her own past. These small acts of teaching gave her purpose, a chance to feel like she was part of something larger than her own suffering. Philip, who had a strange attachment to his constructed reality, occasionally allowed her access to limited resources. But Jaycee was cautious, navigating his unpredictable moods and creating ways to teach her daughters that would avoid drawing his ire. She learned to adapt each day, her daughters' questions sometimes pushing her into difficult emotional spaces, as she struggled to keep them hopeful and safe. The backyard setup began to resemble a fractured version of a home, with various small structures built by Philip over the years. These spaces became a strange, makeshift household for Jaycee and her daughters, though freedom was always out of reach. Philip's control extended over every corner, and Jaycee had to guide her daughters to live within these invisible boundaries, teaching them the reality of their world while helping them dream beyond it. The rare excursions into public continued as the girls grew older, but with each outing, Jaycee faced a renewed sense of loss. Every glimpse of the world outside, the passing faces, the open spaces, and the carefree movements of people served as a reminder of what she and her daughters were denied. Yet, she remained cautious and vigilant, aware that any attempt to escape might endanger her daughters or expose them to Philip's wrath. Despite these obstacles, Jaycee held on to the hope that, one day, her daughters would know freedom. Philip Garrido's behavior grew stranger over the years, his actions increasingly unpredictable. He often ranted about his beliefs, claiming to hear voices and engaging in disorganized projects that Jaycee could hardly understand. She recognized the instability and grew wary, watching him closely and ensuring that her daughters avoided provoking his unpredictable outbursts. As time passed, Jaycee became adept at managing his shifts in behavior, teaching her daughters to remain calm and compliant when Philip was around, even as she worked to protect their innocence. Throughout these years, Philip maintained a facade in the community, attempting to appear as a changed man who had left his dark past behind. He attended meetings, interacted with locals, and even spoke about reforming his life. To those who didn't know him well, he seemed odd but harmless, a reclusive man with eccentric beliefs. This facade allowed him to avoid detection, keeping Jaycee and her daughters hidden in plain sight. One day, Jaycee and her daughters attended an event with Philip, a rare outing that allowed them to interact with people beyond the confines of their prison. Philip introduced Jaycee and the girls as members of his family, carefully constructing a narrative to ensure no one would suspect their true identities. Jaycee's heart raced, torn between the desire to reach out for help and the need to protect her daughters. She knew that any hint of her true identity could bring unpredictable consequences, and so she kept silent, her gaze downcast as she went along with the role Philip had crafted. Jaycee continued to adapt, balancing her protective instincts with the need to survive under Philip's ever-present watch. She taught her daughters the importance of patience, encouraging them to believe that a life beyond this existence was possible, even if it seemed distant. Her bond with them deepened, and through each passing year, Jaycee nurtured their resilience. Despite the physical and emotional confinement, she found strength in their presence, keeping alive the hope that someday they would break free from the grip of the past and find a place in the world beyond. As Jaycee's daughters grew older, the number of times they were seen in public increased, raising questions in the minds of those who came into contact with them. Philip Garrido continued his routine of attending community meetings and speaking publicly, and on rare occasions, he would bring Jaycee and the girls with him. These excursions provided a glimpse into normal life, even if they were carefully orchestrated. Jaycee taught her daughters to behave politely and blend in, coaching them to remain calm and observant of Philip's rules. Despite her resolve to protect her daughters, Jaycee couldn't ignore the anxiety that came with these outings. The fear of being recognized or attracting attention never left her mind. But Jaycee's longing for freedom became stronger with each venture into the outside world, each encounter that hinted at a life beyond captivity. The girls' innocent questions about the things they saw, stores, parks, and schools, filled her with a mix of hope and heartache. To them, these places were mysteries. To Jaycee, they were distant memories of a life that felt as though it had belonged to someone else. Over the years, there were a few times when neighbors, customers, or even local authorities encountered the family and sensed that something wasn't quite right. Some neighbors noticed the makeshift structures in Garrido's backyard and found them strange. But Philip's eccentric behavior provided enough cover, allowing him to pass off any suspicions as part of his unusual personality. He explained the backyard structures as projects or workspaces for his supposed inventions, effectively brushing aside concerns. Jaycee's heart ached during these interactions, knowing that each moment could be an opportunity to escape, but fearing the unknown consequences. Law enforcement officials, too, came close to discovering the truth on more than one occasion. Philip's erratic behavior and criminal record led to parole check-ins, during which officers would come to his property. These visits often filled Jaycee with cautious hope, a belief that maybe, this time, someone would see the signs and recognize her. Yet, Philip managed to keep authorities at bay by controlling what they could access on his property. He strategically concealed the areas where Jaycee and her daughters lived, keeping them hidden behind fences and covered pathways that obscured the view. One instance in particular brought them agonizingly close to discovery. A parole officer came to inspect the property and even entered the backyard area where Jaycee and her daughters were hidden. But once again, Philip's manipulation and deceit won out. He charmed the officer, downplaying any concerns and maintaining his facade as a harmless, if unusual, family man. Jaycee felt the crushing weight of missed freedom with each failed attempt. Still, she remained focused on her daughters' well-being, aware that any move she made would affect them. In time, the mental strain of balancing survival with hope wore on Jaycee. Each interaction with outsiders reminded her of how close she was to freedom, yet how impossibly far away it seemed. She was forced to confront the painful reality that, without outside intervention, she might never escape. And so, she continued to find strength in her daughters, guiding them with patience and teaching them to value kindness, resilience, and love, qualities that Philip's cruelty could never take from them. Despite the darkness surrounding them, Jaycee and her daughters shared moments of joy. She taught them songs and games, and they found ways to celebrate birthdays and holidays with whatever limited resources they had. Jaycee's resolve remained strong, rooted in her desire to provide a loving foundation for her daughters. She wanted them to grow up with a sense of hope, a belief that one day they might be able to live freely. Through all the challenges, Jaycee's love for her daughters kept her resilient, fueling her determination to survive each day with the same quiet courage she had held onto since her capture. Years passed, and Jaycee's hope for freedom became a quiet, constant presence in her mind. Her daughters were growing up, and Jaycee's protective instincts grew stronger as she watched them become curious, resilient individuals despite their confined lives. She had taught them everything she could, weaving together lessons in love, resilience, and kindness. Even as she grappled with her own longing for freedom, her focus remained on shielding them, giving them the tools to survive and find joy, no matter how limited their world remained. In August of 2009, a sudden shift began to unfold. Philip's erratic behavior had started to draw renewed attention, especially when he tried to organize a religious event at a nearby college. His unsettling behavior led campus security officers to alert his parole officer, who ordered him to bring his entire family to a meeting. For Jaycee, it was an unexpected turn, one that filled her with both fear and the faintest glimmer of hope. She prepared her daughters, telling them to stay calm, remain composed, and remember the world outside held promise, even if it was still beyond reach. The day of the meeting, Jaycee and her daughters accompanied Philip to the parole office. She felt a mix of emotions, aware that this interaction could either lead to freedom or backfire. She sat quietly, answering the officer's questions as calmly as she could, holding her daughters close. Then, one of the parole officers asked Jaycee her name, expecting her to respond with the name Alyssa that Philip had given her years ago. In a moment of bravery, she hesitated, allowing a subtle shift in her demeanor that hinted at her true identity. The officers noticed her hesitation, prompting them to dig deeper. Suspicion mounted, and soon enough, they began to separate Philip from Jaycee and her daughters for individual questioning. During this questioning, Jaycee found herself speaking directly with law enforcement in a way she hadn't before. Slowly, bit by bit, she started to open up, though it was difficult after years of being controlled and silenced. She revealed pieces of her life, enough to suggest that she was more than just the person Philip claimed her to be. As the officers continued their questioning, Jaycee felt a surge of courage, emboldened by the presence of authority figures who might finally help her escape. The officers' growing suspicions led them to conduct a background check, and they discovered her true identity. Jaycee Dugard, the young girl who had vanished from South Lake Tahoe 18 years earlier, was now standing before them, very much alive. The realization was overwhelming for everyone in the room. For Jaycee, the moment was surreal, the weight of nearly 2 decades of captivity beginning to lift, even if only slightly. She was free to speak her truth, free to reclaim her identity as Jaycee Dugard. When the news reached her family, it was as though time had shifted for them too. Her mother, who had never given up hope, was notified that Jaycee had been found, and the years of searching, hoping, and praying were finally answered. Jaycee's return was nothing short of a miracle, a moment that defied the darkest of odds. The reunion between Jaycee and her family was both joyful and bittersweet, filled with emotions that words could hardly capture. The years had taken so much from her, yet she had emerged with a strength and resilience that inspired everyone who learned her story. Over the weeks and months following her rescue, Jaycee worked to rebuild her life, finding ways to reconnect with the world she had missed for so long. The process of healing was gradual, filled with challenges, but Jaycee remained determined to move forward. She and her daughters found support and solace in each other, and together they navigated their new reality, a life free from confinement where they could explore, learn, and dream without restriction. Jaycee's story became one of resilience, a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure and overcome. She shared her experiences not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a message of hope and survival. Through her journey, Jaycee showed that even in the darkest of circumstances, there is light to be found, strength to be discovered, and a future to be built. The next and final story is called Taken from Home. The night was calm on June 5, 2002, in Salt Lake City, Utah. A steady silence settled over the Smart family's home, where the soft sounds of breathing and quiet movement had lulled the house into its usual nighttime calm. In her bedroom, 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was asleep, tucked under the blankets with her younger sister Mary beside her. The summer air was warm, filtering through the open windows, and Salt Lake City rested peacefully in the early hours, unaware of the terror that would soon unfold. As midnight passed, the quiet shifted. A presence emerged in the darkness, a man stepping silently into the Smart home, bypassing the locked doors as he made his way through the shadows. This was not a simple break-in. He had come with purpose and certainty. His name was Brian David Mitchell, a figure Elizabeth and her family would come to know all too well. The intruder's movements were stealthy, his figure moving carefully through the home. The family dog, sensing an unfamiliar presence, began to growl softly, but inexplicably went quiet. As Mitchell crept closer, his intentions grew more apparent. His target was Elizabeth. She stirred as a hand clamped over her mouth, silencing her. Her eyes opened, confused and panicked, but her instincts kept her silent. Mitchell whispered that he had a weapon and threatened her softly, ordering her to come with him. The young girl, caught in a nightmare she could scarcely comprehend, obeyed, afraid any resistance might escalate the situation further. With Elizabeth in tow, Mitchell led her outside and into the stillness of the night. The silence in the streets was absolute, only broken by the quiet rustle of footsteps as Mitchell pulled her away from the safety of her home. Elizabeth's mind raced, her fear an unbearable weight, but she dared not speak. She could see her house fading away in the distance as they ventured deeper into the city's shadows, her heart pounding as she struggled to process the events unfolding around her. Her family had no way of knowing what had just taken place. Back in the house, Mary lay undisturbed, unaware of her sister's departure. Mitchell moved swiftly, pulling Elizabeth through alleyways and across unlit paths until they reached a secluded mountain path that snaked up into the woods. With each step, Elizabeth felt herself drawn further from the world she knew, taken away from the life she had left only minutes earlier, but which now felt impossibly distant. Once they reached the woods, Mitchell's accomplice, Wanda Barzee, was waiting. She was no stranger to Mitchell's plans, having followed him willingly into this shared vision of a twisted fate for Elizabeth. The two captors worked together, pulling Elizabeth into a secluded area hidden by trees and brush. They whispered commands, moving her deeper into the wilderness, leaving behind any chance of discovery. Elizabeth's reality was transformed in those moments, and the comforting world she'd once known was replaced by the unyielding terror of her surroundings. Hours later, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the Smart family awoke to an unthinkable horror. Elizabeth was gone. Her parents, Ed and Lois Smart, quickly realized something was wrong and scrambled to understand where their daughter could be. The police were summoned, and a search began, but the mystery of her sudden disappearance would puzzle everyone. Neighbors and family joined in a frantic effort to locate her, combing through the local area, each person gripped by fear as they called her name. They searched parks, yards, and alleyways, hoping to find her nearby, but she was nowhere to be found. Elizabeth's family was devastated, each passing hour deepening their terror as the search expanded. As local authorities began to ask questions, they learned about Mary, Elizabeth's younger sister, who had seen something. Mary hesitantly revealed that she had been awakened by the sounds in their room. She had even seen the shadow of a man, though she had not realized the full scope of what was happening. She confessed how she had felt frozen with fear and had pretended to be asleep, listening as her sister was taken. In a moment of silent bravery, she had clung to her instinct to stay still, knowing that any sudden movement might lead to more danger. She remembered the man's low voice, the words he had used to frighten Elizabeth into obedience. The police listened, and her account added an urgent new layer to their search, confirming that this was no ordinary disappearance. But the Utah wilderness where Elizabeth had been taken was vast and seemingly impenetrable, making a search complex and frustrating. In those early days, police and volunteers formed search parties, traversing mountain paths and rocky terrain, calling Elizabeth's name into the vast emptiness that separated them from her. Each step they took, each area they combed, yielded nothing. The questions mounted, but answers were scarce, leaving only an overwhelming sense of loss and frustration. Elizabeth was now far from any familiar sights or sounds, deep in the Utah wilderness. Her captor, Brian David Mitchell, led her further up the mountain trail, with his companion Wanda Barzee close behind. Mitchell's voice was steady but low, muttering words Elizabeth couldn't fully grasp but which seemed filled with conviction. Fear settled heavily over her as they moved deeper into the isolated terrain. Each step took her farther from home, her life, and everything she knew. As they arrived at a hidden encampment, Elizabeth saw that Mitchell and Barzee had constructed a crude shelter camouflaged within the thick brush and trees. The area was remote, hidden from view, and shielded from anyone who might pass by. Here, Mitchell began to speak with a strange authority, explaining his intentions in ways Elizabeth could barely comprehend. He called himself a prophet, as though he believed he was destined to be her keeper, weaving tales of his purpose with a conviction that made Elizabeth's heart race with unease. Days blurred together as Elizabeth was forced to adapt to her surroundings and comply with Mitchell's bizarre demands. The landscape around her became a harsh reminder of her captivity, with tall trees standing like sentries and thick brush hemming her in. Mitchell imposed strict rules, and Barzee acted as his enforcer, maintaining an unsettling control over Elizabeth. Her every movement was scrutinized, every glance noted, as though any sign of rebellion would be punished. Mitchell's unpredictable behavior only added to her fear, as he would sometimes disappear into bouts of quiet reflection, only to return with strange proclamations that seemed to further cement her isolation. As the days turned to weeks, Elizabeth felt the weight of her captivity pressing down. She clung to memories of home, her family, and the life she'd left behind, determined not to lose herself. She reminded herself of her family's love and the warmth of her home, holding on to these memories as anchors in a reality that felt increasingly distant. Mitchell, however, seemed intent on breaking any semblance of hope. Why? He would often remind her of her isolation, hinting that no one would be able to find them in this remote expanse of wilderness. There were moments when Elizabeth's presence of mind nearly faltered, but she fought to remain strong. She knew that yielding to fear would only give her captors greater control. Instead, she focused on small acts of resilience, like counting the days or recalling simple memories of family gatherings. Though small, these actions helped her maintain a sense of self amid the harsh surroundings. Barzee, sensing Elizabeth's quiet defiance, sometimes attempted to break down these mental defenses, echoing Mitchell's words and pushing Elizabeth to accept this new life. Yet, Elizabeth's resolve remained, even when hope seemed faint. One day, as Mitchell took her outside the camp under the cover of darkness, Elizabeth caught sight of faint city lights in the distance. The sight stirred a mixture of hope and heartbreak, knowing that her family and life lay just beyond her reach. The lights flickered like distant stars, a reminder of the world that was waiting for her, if she could only find a way back. She held onto this image, promising herself that one day she would see those lights up close, that she would return to the warmth and safety of her home. Mitchell's routines and teachings grew more erratic over time. He would sometimes speak of visions and delusions that made no sense to Elizabeth, but which seemed to fuel his sense of purpose. His behavior was a disturbing blend of control and fanaticism, a cycle that Elizabeth learned to navigate carefully, knowing any misstep could lead to further restrictions. She maintained a delicate balance, aware that her survival depended on her ability to read Mitchell's moods and respond accordingly. Each day required a careful calculation, a mix of compliance and quiet endurance that became her lifeline. As weeks turned into months, Elizabeth's resilience became her shield. She found strength in small victories, like enduring a day without drawing Mitchell's ire or recalling a cherished memory to keep her spirits up. The landscape, once an alien and oppressive force, began to feel like something she could endure, each tree and rock forming a part of the world she would one day leave behind. But even as she clung to hope, the reality of her captivity loomed large. Mitchell's control was unyielding, and Barzee's compliance seemed unwavering, as though they both believed in a reality that bore no relation to the outside world. The isolation was absolute, and yet, through it all, Elizabeth maintained a quiet strength, a resolve that would carry her through the coming months. As the months dragged on, Elizabeth remained in the desolate wilderness, struggling to maintain her sense of self amid the relentless control that Mitchell and Barzee exerted. Each day felt like an endless repetition, her captor's influence wrapping around her, like the unyielding trees that surrounded the camp. She found herself caught in a world where time seemed to stand still, the familiar markers of days and weeks erased, replaced by a bleak monotony that tested her resolve. Mitchell grew more unpredictable, his actions driven by beliefs that made little sense to Elizabeth. He would spend hours immersed in what he called visions, often isolating himself only to emerge with new demands or proclamations. Barzee followed his lead without question, taking on the role of enforcer whenever Elizabeth tried to resist. The strict rituals, rules, and isolation became suffocating, yet Elizabeth learned to adapt, her survival resting on a delicate balance of outward compliance and internal strength. In quiet moments, Elizabeth would recall the faces of her family, allowing her memories to serve as a barrier against despair. She would mentally revisit familiar places, the comforting hum of her family's home, and the gentle laughter shared during family gatherings. These recollections became her refuge, helping her to maintain her inner world even as her captors sought to break her down. She knew that no matter how long her captivity lasted, these memories were her own, untouched by Mitchell's twisted control. In rare moments, Elizabeth was taken from the camp, often at night, hidden under layers of clothing that concealed her identity. On one of these trips, she was led to a store under the watchful eyes of Mitchell and Barzee. The experience of being out in public, so close to freedom yet unable to reach out for help, was both torturous and surreal. She walked among strangers, the desire to scream for help battling against the fear of retaliation. The sight of ordinary people going about their lives, unaware of her struggle, left her feeling both hopeful and heartbroken as she realized the delicate line she was walking. Mitchell seemed to take a strange satisfaction from these public outings, as though they reinforced his control over Elizabeth. He would remind her, once they were back in the confines of the camp, that no one would be able to find them, that her family had moved on, and that her old life was a distant memory. Elizabeth resisted these assertions, anchoring herself in the belief that her family would never stop searching. She knew they were out there, that her disappearance left a void they would never abandon. As her captivity wore on, Elizabeth became more adept at reading Mitchell's mood shifts, recognizing the subtle changes in his tone that signaled danger or safety. Barbara, though generally quieter, would echo Mitchell's ideas, reinforcing the isolation Elizabeth felt. Her captors' belief in their mission created an atmosphere of unease that permeated every moment. To endure, Elizabeth learned to tread carefully, keeping her thoughts to herself and responding with the restraint and control that each situation demanded. Yet there were moments of vulnerability that surfaced when she least expected them. A sound, a phrase, or a memory would sometimes overwhelm her, bringing a wave of homesickness so intense it nearly broke her composure. In these moments, Elizabeth would close her eyes, envisioning herself back home, surrounded by the voices and love of her family. She held these moments tightly, her will to survive fueled by the unyielding belief that she would see them again. Mitchell's unpredictable nature often brought sudden changes to her daily existence. He would sometimes speak of grand plans, a vision he claimed only he understood, while other times he would slip into quiet contemplation, leaving Elizabeth and Barbara to maintain the bleak routine. Elizabeth learned to navigate this ebb and flow, recognizing that her own adaptability was her greatest strength. She became skilled at managing her responses, keeping herself steady even when Mitchell's actions seemed to shift without warning. As days stretched into months, Elizabeth's resilience took on a new form. She became an expert at managing her thoughts, controlling her reactions, and finding brief moments of calm within herself. Each memory she held, each thought of her family, became a silent act of defiance, a reminder that her spirit remained unbroken. Her hope lay in small acts of resistance, quiet, internal reminders of who she was, who she would always be, regardless of the hold Mitchell and Barbara tried to have over her. The landscape that had once felt like an inescapable prison began to change in her mind. Elizabeth learned the lay of the land, familiarizing herself with her surroundings in a way that gave her a sense of control. Each tree, each ridge became a marker of her endurance, a testament to the strength that grew quietly within her. In the face of such isolation, she created her own world within, a place Mitchell and Barbara could never access, a refuge that kept her spirit alive. Elizabeth's family remained relentless in their search, the void left by her absence fueling a determination that only grew stronger as the days turned into months. Media outlets soon picked up the story, casting a national spotlight on her case. Posters bearing her face were placed throughout the city, and strangers across the country joined in, sending words of support and solidarity. The search for Elizabeth was no longer confined to Salt Lake City. It had become a nationwide effort, with her family at the heart, rallying the public and refusing to let hope fade. Ed and Lois Smart held press conferences, their voices a steady force amid the turmoil. They spoke directly to Elizabeth, as if she could somehow hear them, urging her to hold on and stay strong. Their appeals were heartfelt and unwavering, their pain visible, yet laced with determination. Through these efforts, they transformed their private anguish into a public call for action. Volunteers, local residents, and even those who had never met Elizabeth offered their support, helping distribute flyers, canvassing neighborhoods, and forming search parties. The collective determination was a testament to the impact of Elizabeth's story, a ripple that spread across communities. Despite the efforts, leads remained scarce, and the police faced mounting pressure to produce results. Investigators sifted through tips and possible sightings, each one bringing a momentary flash of hope before often fading into disappointment. It seemed that each clue brought them no closer to Elizabeth, the elusive nature of her disappearance adding to the growing frustration among those closest to her. Some leads even extended to surrounding states, with potential sightings reported in distant towns, but each time they were met with dead ends. Mary's account of the night Elizabeth was taken became a focal point in the investigation. She recounted the figure she had seen, the voice she had heard, yet the details, though chilling, yielded few concrete answers. Police sketched a profile based on her description, and the search continued. Investigators re-examined Elizabeth's daily routines, her friendships, and every known detail about the Smart family, hoping to uncover anything that might lead them to her whereabouts. The search was relentless, but Elizabeth's captors had planned her concealment meticulously, keeping her hidden from even the most determined efforts. Elizabeth, though physically distant from the search, was not untouched by the public outcry. Mitchell and Barzee, aware of the media coverage, sometimes allowed Elizabeth glimpses of the news, using it as a way to reinforce her isolation. They claimed that her family had moved on, suggesting she was now beyond anyone's reach. But Elizabeth knew her family, and she clung to the belief that they would never stop searching. Her faith in their dedication became a source of inner strength, a lifeline that helped her endure each day. As winter approached, conditions in the mountains grew harsher. The cold became another layer of hardship, each drop in temperature another reminder of her captivity. Mitchell and Barzee provided little to shield her from the elements, a harsh indifference that underscored the control they held over her. Yet even the unforgiving weather could not shake her resolve. Elizabeth found small ways to endure, wrapping herself in blankets whenever possible and clinging to the memories of warmth and comfort from home. The search efforts, however, continued to grow. Law enforcement brought in additional resources, turning to experts skilled in finding missing persons. Psychologists worked alongside detectives, creating profiles and analyzing behavior, trying to predict the actions of whoever had taken Elizabeth. Each day, the case grew colder in some ways, yet the relentless drive to find her pushed against the odds, the combined force of her family's love and the nation's determination an unbreakable bond. Through it all, Elizabeth stayed vigilant, her mind keenly aware of her surroundings. She became adept at noticing details about her captors, quietly observing the routines they followed and the places they frequented. She understood that each piece of knowledge she gathered was another tool, another potential path toward eventual freedom. The thought of escape, though distant, stayed alive in her mind, a spark that refused to die even in the darkest moments. Months of captivity had worn Elizabeth down, but she had held on to hope, focusing on her family's love and the life that awaited her beyond the isolated wilderness. Her resilience had become her shield, allowing her to withstand the endless days and the control exerted by her captors. Little did she know that, as winter shifted to spring, events were unfolding that would bring her closer to freedom. Back in Salt Lake City, Elizabeth's family had never stopped searching. The public support had sustained their efforts, and detectives continued pursuing every possible lead. Then a critical break arrived. A woman recognized a sketch of Brian David Mitchell that had been circulated based on Mary's account. The woman believed she had seen him with a young girl who looked like Elizabeth, and she immediately contacted the police. This tip, among others, reignited the investigation with new energy. As authorities followed this lead with the hope that Elizabeth's ordeal might finally come to an end. Meanwhile, Mitchell, aware of the intensified attention, grew increasingly cautious. He often disguised Elizabeth, covering her face and dressing her in a way that concealed her identity whenever they ventured into public spaces. Still, there was a sense of unease in his behavior, as if he sensed the walls closing in. He seemed more anxious, aware that his hold over Elizabeth might soon face an external threat. Barzee, always by his side, supported his efforts, yet even she seemed to recognize the shifting tension. In early March, the three were out walking in public, navigating the streets under Mitchell's careful watch. It was one of those rare moments when Elizabeth found herself within reach of people who might help, and the idea of escape flickered in her mind. Her heart raced, knowing that this could be her chance, though the risk was immense. Then, as fate would have it, a police officer approached them, having received reports of a sighting matching Elizabeth's description. The officer, determined to investigate, engaged them in conversation, his tone both firm and composed as he asked questions. Elizabeth, afraid to reveal herself but equally desperate, answered carefully, her responses suggesting hints of her identity. The officer sensed something unusual in her demeanor, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that hinted at her true identity. He continued, probing gently, aware of the gravity of the situation. Mitchell grew defensive, attempting to deflect the officer's attention, but the officer's suspicions only grew. Finally, in a decisive moment, He asked Elizabeth directly, using her name and giving her an opening to respond. Elizabeth's heart raced as she heard her name spoken aloud, a sound that felt like a lifeline. Summoning the courage that had sustained her through months of captivity, she affirmed her identity. The officer immediately secured her safety, separating her from Mitchell and Barzee, who could only watch as the control they had exercised over her shattered in an instant. The reality of her freedom settled over Elizabeth, the weight of her captivity lifting as she realized that her nightmare was finally ending. Elizabeth's return to her family was a moment of overwhelming relief and joy. Her parents embraced her, their gratitude spilling over as they reunited with their daughter. The public, too, celebrated her safe return, as her story had touched the hearts of people across the nation. Elizabeth's resilience and strength became a symbol of hope and survival, her journey serving as a reminder of the power of courage in the face of unimaginable hardship. In the days that followed, Elizabeth took her first steps toward healing. The experiences she had endured remained with her, but her family's support helped her begin the process of reclaiming her life. She knew that her story would forever be a part of her, yet she remained determined to move forward, embracing the future with the same strength that had carried her through her darkest days. Mitchell and Barzee faced justice for their actions, held accountable for the pain they had caused. Elizabeth's testimony played a crucial role in ensuring that they could no longer harm others. Her story, though marked by suffering, became one of survival, an account of enduring strength that resonated far beyond her own life. Elizabeth's journey had tested her in ways few could understand, yet she emerged with a spirit that refused to be broken. Her story served as both a cautionary tale and a testament to resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the possibility of light remains. As she moved forward, Elizabeth embraced the life she had fought so hard to return to, knowing that her strength and the love of those around her would guide her through the path ahead. If today's stories reminded you of the strength of the human spirit in the darkest of times, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the strange, dark, and mysterious. Turn on notifications so you never miss a daily upload. We'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. What part of these stories stood out to you the most? Thank you for watching. Stay aware, stay resilient, and remember, even in the darkest places, hope can shine through. We'll see you in the next story.